So thank you, Peter and Roberto, for inviting me here to give this presentation. And it looks like Peter has done a nice job giving you a basic introduction to my practice. For over a decade now, I've been interested very much in the idea of using flight and air as a medium for art. And merging multiple media and engineering practices, I will construct and control aesthetic systems that work with air and are often themselves airborne. Throughout my practice, I'm very much interested in engaging with issues on hybridity, the non-human and human-machine interaction, in hopes to explore our place within these complex systems. Today, I'm going to talk mostly, or focus mostly, on a very recent work titled Nervous Thrasher. Nervous Thrasher was presented this year in February at Current Plans. I'm not necessarily focusing on this because I myself am a little nervous, well, maybe a little bit, but regardless, I think it fits really well in with what Peter and Roberto are doing with MetaMaps and multimodal mapping. Nervous Thrasher, for me, is a visceral combination of performance, power, sound, strange encounters that we see both in reality and also in cinema. Therefore, sci-fi is also incorporated into this performance and installation, as well as B-humor, or the absurd concepts that come from B-humor that we see often in cinema as well. All of that is introduced or is part of the root or the core of how I'm developing the abstract narrative for the performance and how I can then engage that with the human experience and the audience. Overall, I describe it as an experimental installation involving acts of sonification from airborne sculptures. I made the conscious decision before doing the work not to depend on professional cameras or other devices for recording and archiving the work. Instead, I decided that I would rely only on social media. The following is a very short social media cut. So following the social media cut, I would like to briefly comment that there is a history to airborne art. And part of my practice is researching what has existed before, and a lesser known example comes from Charles Fraser's a work journal of flying sculpture, which he published in art form in 1967. At the end of introducing a number of different versions of his aerial sculptures, he talks about flying sculpture and how it relates to Western tradition, being an offspring of Calder's mobiles, but also he later describes that this is the next logical step for releasing sculpture from the ground, out of the museums and into the world. For me, however, in the 21st century, with innovative technologies, we can see that with the use of drones, sensors, and artificial intelligence or machine learning, the possibility for a new dynamic and spectacular airborne art is possible. In Nervous Thrasher, there were two airborne sculptures, one being the flying car wheel, and the other this very strange, unusual helium-assisted sculpture. Of course, also, this was a little bit different for me because in the past, when I create aerial sculptures and incorporate machine intelligence with them, I will let them perform by themselves. This time, I was very much a part of this relationship, introducing my own body within these systems, which also became moments of provocation with the audience and also copious amounts of sweat from myself if you happened to be there. 45 minutes back to back performing, I was drenched, but I wanted that sweat to be there. And in talking about, and because that for me, it brings in also the emotion of being in the lab and this madness of creating these things. And in this case with the flying car wheel, I want to highlight that this is not a real car wheel. And in fact, it is way, way, way too challenging to do this with a real car wheel. And also, it is one of my missions when I create these airborne sculptures to not have a drone carrying a car wheel, but rather it's a car wheel that has evolved to become a hexacopter. And because this is so challenging to do with the heavy weight of a real tire, I depended on my hyper-realistic sculptural techniques, as well as some skills in 3D modeling and 3D printing processes, and also incorporating into the system or embedding into the system my highly configurable flight controller. To begin the development of this, I started prototyping to scale. Seen here on screen is not an ideal way to do this. In terms of engineering methods, this is FDM, carbon fiber, nylon filament, FDM layer by layer printing, printed in 6 and then welded together. In order for me to best understand how to work out the numbers and computations for the flight controller. I then took this out to a remote location or a rural location in Hong Kong for a beta test flight outside of a confined studio space, because if you are familiar with working in Hong Kong, we often have smaller spaces. So for when I need to understand how well this thing can fly, I need to go outdoors in a more open area. And away it went.
UFO.
Yeah, and to keep a long, dramatic story short, I got one flight. It collided with a tree, but it's okay. Yeah, I've made peace with that. And it also, for me, it provided enough evidence that this form and my flight controller and the motors and the propellers that I've purchased were capable and powerful enough for aerobatics. I then proceeded to develop this. Ideally, using nylon SLS printing would be perfect because it's used in aerospace engineering, but I opted for ABS-like resin due to cost. To this day, the ABS-like resin has successfully completed all of my stress tests, and you could see in the social media cut towards the end, I ripped the tire up close to the ceiling, I cut throttle and let it drop down. That's the most impact this version of the sculpture has gone through. I don't know how much more I want to give it, but that's okay. Additionally, when doing this, we have to consider weight. I don't want it too light because then it's fragile, but I also don't want it too heavy because then I don't have a very good thrust to weight ratio. Each one of my motors produces about 1.5 kg at 100% throttle. Add on additional weight of other components, and you're left with about 4:1 thrust to weight ratio. 25% throttle, you're already hovering. So this thing does have a decent amount of rip. I then introduce into it some of my finishing techniques. Here we can see the rim is both heated and scoured chrome paint. And then I push into that surface a combination of car wax and dirt and grime and soil from the earth, and also the street. To develop the tire, it's not rubber, but it's meant to just kind of give us the feeling as if it is or could be a tire through photographs or in low lighting situations or from at a distance. Shown here on the right is my process of laminating and engraving the expanded polyethylene foam. Finish to scale. I had to verify that it matched. I think it works. It's believable enough. I added on the flight controller, the rotors, and the battery. And because these motors are very powerful, they're also energy hungry. And the battery doesn't last long, but that also, for me, is not just a compromise, because it's also something I want during the performance. I want to prolong and delay how the kind of nervous or anxiety about whether or not this tire will take off. And then the moment I do take it off, it's a sudden burst. It happens for a short amount of time, then it lands back on the ground. That is also with, is a part of the concept. To go on a tangent, we'll rewind a little bit. I think it's important to do this. Back in 2022, I did a scaled iteration of a work of mine under the title Floating Room. And this iteration was presented in a very small, confined space at the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C. The previous version of Floating Room was presented in 2017 at Chronus Art Center in Shanghai. Then I was using ready-made drones. And this was not the first time I used ready-made, but I was already starting to have an internal artistic engineering struggle where you have a ready-made drone. That ready-made drone is, in essence, is carrying the lamp, even though the shell of the lamp is constructed around the drone's body. But in 2022, I gave myself about 10 months before the Smithsonian show that I would start to develop my own highly configurable flight controller so that it would fit better in with my concept of the object has evolved into the drone or the aerial vehicle that has this new ability to fly. And for me, that is a little bit more like a creature. And in this case, I ended up I went into a garage space in the Midwest of America, and I 3D scanned the entire garage, and then there was a fire extinguisher, and I was like, okay, that's perfect. I can turn that into a creature with this wobbly nose. It looks a little bit something like this. The flying sculpture is using an artificial neural network for obstacle avoidance. An array of sensors. Fast forward a little bit so that we can look at the bottom of this crushed up, 3D scanned, printed, strange fire extinguisher. There's an array of 5 different time-of-flight sensors. Each one of those time-of-flight sensors are constantly reading the room, and it has a 3-dimensional space. And for me, this artificial neural network that I'm using, I believe is imperfect. I know it's imperfect. But that is what makes it more exciting in terms of these exaggerated flight behaviors. When I use the ready-made drones, they're very stable. And that looks good in some cases, but in other cases, I want the feeling to be a little bit more quick and aerobatic and under constant change. And so that's why I started to develop my own and using different kinds of ways of working with the artificial neural network to use it as both a sophisticated way of understanding space, but also as a way to complicate things and make it more exaggerated. A very similar artificial neural network is used for this strange helium-assisted sculpture that moves through space. And I think it's also the moment where this is how this work fits really well in with the MetaMaps or the multimodal mapping. And that is the autonomous flight controller is constantly reading its space, trying to figure out how to move, how to navigate, and then that in-flight data is wirelessly transmitted back to a remote server for real-time audio synthesis that is then amplified out into the space to be felt and heard by audience. An example of how the sound design gets developed goes a little bit something like this. You have a single rotor and propeller. You synthesize that in a note A. And then A minor seventh with a little reverb. And then sonification of flight. Okay, one more time, but faster. Now you get the idea. Okay, so the software I'm using is Super Collider in order to create this real-time audio synthesis and the wireless network communication. It's not identical to the example I just gave you, but it's a similar workflow where I start with non-tempo drone loops, and then I run those through a granular synthesizer. In the previous example, I'm not doing that, but the methods of creating the sound design, the platform in which I use, and the way I do the mapping is always different, but following a similar methodology. It's a little bit smaller and hard to see on screen. On the bottom right, you can see where flight controller real-time data-driven sound design is starting to happen. And things like the granular synthesizer's rate is being controlled by the artificial neural network, one data set from that. Another data set is controlling the rates of the grain. You also have position controlling the pan, a number of different variables in how that sound gets immediately reinterpreted and generated compositions based off of that real-time data that's being wirelessly transmitted. The network communication for me is part of what makes it complex. The sound design itself, for any expert would see, is actually quite simple. It's not overly complicated, in other words. But for me, what's happening between the sculpture and the immediate surroundings and its encounters with people, and how people are constantly moving in space, and how that dictates part of the composition, is where things get the most complex and interesting for me. For the flying, I'm sorry, Peter, I keep blocking you. For the flying tire, I'm not using the flight controllers. This is different. So, whereas in the previous airborne sculpture, I am using the in-flight data from the autonomous flight controller, in this case, I'm using my own input as a way to generate the sound while flying the car wheel. So this is operated from the remote control that's connected up with the flying car wheel. This case, I'm thinking mostly about heavy bass, powerful subwoofer, the beats per minute of that bass being controlled by the throttle of the remote control, and then also introducing in there a sol or a wobble synth, and that is being controlled also by the throttle. And then we have the frequency being controlled by the pitch of the drone, and then I believe the cutoffs for the frequency of the bass is being controlled by the roll. Very, very simple, but for me, this is part of the experience, the human experience, because we are not just visually seeing the car wheel airborne and going through traversing space, airspace, but we are also hearing it and we're feeling it simultaneously. And I think that, to me, is very impactful and visceral. And then to quickly conclude, some of the research and development that was used in the work Nervous Thrasher this year also finds its place in enhancing embodied telepresence in first-person view drone pilots through real-time data-driven sound design. That's a really long title. I don't remember any of you to ever go through your papers with such a long title, but I think it drives home the point. I think it's important to note that in FPV drone flying, the perception of the pilot merges with that of the drone, so thus the mind and the machine are in sync, and the pilot embodies this soaring aerial vehicle. And for the 29th International Symposium on Electronic Art, I will go to present this research. This full peer-reviewed paper examines current limitations of human-drone sensory overlay and introduces a widely applicable methodology for oral sensory stimulation in FPV drone control. And I'm doing this in hopes that the FPV pilot can then transcend the current limitations of ocular centrism in drone control and access an immediate oral landscape that induces a heightened sense of spatial awareness while airborne. This early study with this pilot, I asked him in the very, very beginning, why did you get involved with FPV drone flying? And he said, because it offered him a new perspective, something like a bird. So in this early clip, this very quick study with him, I think this is quite fitting. It's very quick. Okay, so that one he obviously enjoyed the most of the different sound designs that I presented to him. This was, again, very early studies, and I'm currently working on turning this into a more compositional work with a little bit more purpose, and that is what I will be presenting at ASIA this June. Anyway, thank you all for your attention, and